Friday, after 2 days of wrestling with this gospel text and thinking about issues of sight and blindness, on Friday I went to the optometrist and the dermatologist. Oddly, I got more insight about sight from the dermatologist than from the eye doctor. In some ways, these two things, the gospel text and doctor visits, are not connected. The eye exam happens annually, and I had the dermatologist appointment way back in December. I scheduled it. After my biopsy came back as a melanoma, and it's fine, it was removed, everything's fine, but it does mean I have to go to the dermatologist every 3 months for a while. And so I made that appointment long before I looked at this gospel text. At Friday's dermatology visit, we talked about my last visit, about how we both first thought my melanoma was something else. It looked like a pinkish bug bite, not like the classic dark, mold-on, terribly wrong kind of melanoma. But because it turned out to be a melanoma, on Friday we evaluated my skin much more thoroughly than we ever did before. My dermatologist decided to biopsy 3 more spots, which she likely wouldn't have done if I hadn't had the last biopsy that came back as a melanoma. In today's gospel, too, we see people taking a second look, maybe even a third look. In some cases, the extra look has life-saving implications. Sadly, though, that's not always the case. The disciples see a blind man and ask who sinned. This belief would be common in ancient times when disease was thought to be an outward sign of inward unworthiness. And in many ways, we still see vestiges of this belief today. I thought of it recently when an old grad school friend announced he had esophageal cancer, and another grad school friend and I tried to remember when he had stopped smoking. It seems a modern method of doing what these disciples did, trying to establish who is at blame for the misfortune, and often, sadly, looking for a way to show that it is the fault of the person who has fallen victim to, in this case, esophageal cancer. And there's also more than a bit of trying to reassure ourselves that we can avoid misfortune by virtuous living. Jesus gives an answer that we would now expect. Nobody is to blame. And then Jesus goes further, saying that he can use this misfortune to glorify God. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is always on the lookout for ways to show people who he is. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus knows that he is the Messiah from the get-go, from the very beginning. And he's always trying to let others know too. It might be with long discussions with people like Nicodemus and the woman at the well from our last several weeks of readings. This Sunday, Jesus shows he is the Messiah by making a blind man able to see, and later telling the blind man that he is in the presence of the Son of Man who is the light of the world. This healing bothers me, though, and it's not about the spit. If Jesus walked into this sanctuary right now and offered to heal the arthritis in my feet with his holy spit and this dirt, I would have my shoes off lickety-split. But it's the fact that Jesus doesn't ask the man if he wants to be healed, the way he does with so many others. I know that it's my 21st century sensibility that makes me wish that Jesus had looked for a way to show the blind man had different abilities, like enhanced hearing. I wish that Jesus had asked permission before he rubbed mud on the man, or at the very least told him what he was about to do, the way the best doctors tell us what's going to happen before they do the procedure, like my dermatologist who says, now I'm going to take a picture of this spot, and now I'm looking for blood vessels that look like this. But that's not what Jesus does. The next part of the text, though, is even more disturbing. Although it is a good teaching moment about rebirth and healing, we see the reaction of all the neighbors, some of whom don't recognize the blind man who can now see, and some who even doubt it is the same man. By now it's clear we're working with the idea of blindness on many levels. Had the neighbors really never seen the blind man at all? How could they not recognize him? I assume they spent some time assisting him. Perhaps they are like my dermatologist who sees me in a new way now that I've had a melanoma. But it's probably something more troubling. It's tempting to say that they never saw him, but just saw his disability, but that's probably more of a 21st century approach. What's probably more accurate about their disbelief is what the blind man says later. This kind of healing has never been done in the whole history of the world. They're so busy looking for explanations that they fail to see the miraculous. They might see, but can't accept the miraculous. Maybe it just takes them a while to process what they have witnessed. And let's be honest, the religious leaders are not much help. As usual, when the religious leaders are depicted in the Gospel of John, they get bogged down in the legalistic angles of the question. If Jesus healed on the Sabbath, he couldn't really be doing miracles God. Could he? The reaction of the blind man's parents show how much power the religious leaders have. The blind man's parents can't even rejoice for fear of being displaced from their community. And their answer also shows a way of dealing with this kind of power, a sort of understated defiance when they say, go ask our son, he's a grown man, ask the blind man who he saw, heal him. They're not rejecting their son so much as they're rejecting the relevance of the question. And oh, this poor blind man, back and forth he goes, summoned for interrogation, released, re-examined with the same questions. It reminds me of what Jesus will go through when we get to Holy Week. Ask again and again and again, and he says, I told you, I told you, I told you. And finally, the blind man here is exasperated. And in verse 25, he says, I don't know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Keep in mind, he can't even describe the man who healed him. He's only heard his voice and followed his instructions to wash afterward, after Jesus has gone. He doesn't see Jesus with his physical eyes until the end of the gospel. As with so many encounters with Jesus, in a way that's similar to the stories of Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman at the well, the blind man doesn't understand what he's been shown, at least not at first. And to be fair, most of us are the same way. It takes time to adjust to a new situation, to new information, to a diagnosis that comes back that is different from what we had expected or hoped for, to a flood of light that breaks through the gloom. The blind man has heard the voice of Jesus before he could see him, has felt the fingers of Jesus smearing mud on his eyes, but he doesn't actually see Jesus with his newly opened eyes until after the relentless questioners have made their judgment and moved along. The blind man has several encounters with Jesus. In the first one, he hears the voice of Jesus. In the second one, after he's been interrogated, he comes to understand who Jesus is as he sees him, face to face. And we don't read the next chapter of John in this morning's gospel, and you're probably saying, thank goodness, that was a very long gospel as it was. But if we did, we'd have an even richer understanding of both this text and chapter 10, the one that follows. In chapter 10, Jesus talks at great length about sheep and shepherds and the ones who hear his voice and respond. If we read them together, it's clear that the blind man heard the Lord's voice and responded, whereas so many others do not. The blind man isn't the only one in today's gospel who has heard the voice of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Jesus heals the blind man in a way that shows the power of God's love to all of the members of the blind man's community and family. We might be left wondering what happened to the blind man and his family and the larger community. But if we read further, we find out that with each miracle, Jesus' circle of followers grows. With each miracle, the landscape changes for Jesus and for all who see and hear him. With each miracle, we see people expand their ideas of what might be possible in this world. As I watched the dermatologist study my skin, I thought about how the landscape of my body has also changed. Once we looked and we saw a spot, we said, it's a bug bite. Sun damage. That's an age spot. Now my dermatologist lingers on every spot. She has a special magnifying glass. She takes pictures so that she can magnify even more. She does this just to make sure that she's seeing what's there, not turning a blind eye, not overlooking potentially deadly cancers. Jesus, too, encourages us to see our landscapes differently. As with skin, there are many spots that might turn out to be nothing major at least, like community members who don't really know us or care to look closely. But there are also spots that might turn out to be malevolent, like the Pharisees in the story, who at the very end of the gospel, they still don't understand how blind they are, how they are not perceiving what's right there in front of them. Again and again, Jesus reminds us of how God knows us down to our tiniest details. Again and again, Jesus encourages us to hear God's voice and recognize our Creator. Jesus continues to invite us to experience transformation and healing, transformation that might seem impossible when we first consider it. Jesus knows that if we say yes to his invitations, we might also attract the attention of badgering, oppressive forces that are out there in society, those forces that want us to believe that things can't change, that things can't be different, that lives can't be turned around. But Jesus also promises that he will be beside us all the way as we testify to the power of God, as we testify to each and every earthly power that once we were spiritually blind, but now we see.